Y'all may remember that in the example that I gave y'all for the Unit 9 project, it was a song, This Is America by Childish Gambino. So we talked about discrimination and prejudice and race in the example of that project. That does play a role in social psychology. So we're going to talk about all of these categories. We're going to talk about prejudice, discrimination, stereotyping, dehumanization, racism, and ethnocentrism. So racism is the categorization of a person or a group based on their race or ethnicity. Okay, that's part one. There's multiple parts to it. Part one is categorization based on race or ethnicity. Part two is the systemic mistreatment of people in the targeted group. Let me say that again. The systemic mistreatment of that targeted group. So not only do you have to categorize them as a group based on race or ethnicity, there also has to be a system in place or an institution that's focused on targeting them. Ethnocentrism is judging other cultures based only on the values of your own culture. So you look at another culture and you're like, oh, that's weird. Why do they do it that way? Like if you look at a culture that's vegetarian, and as Americans, we put meat in every meal, breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, second breakfast. There's sausage in literally all of our biscuits. We may look at another culture that's primarily vegetarian and just be like, how? Okay, but then also other cultures look at us and think, what's going on with them? For instance, I saw on Twitter a bunch of like Canadians and Europeans. They're all just like, so wait a minute. You're telling me that every day that you're in school, at the very beginning, everyone stands up and salutes the flag and recites a pledge. Like to us, that's normal because we've done it K through 12th grade. You stand up, you do the Pledge of Allegiance. In other countries, that is weird. They're just like, okay, this is getting a little like creepy with how you're like, they call it like indoctrinating the kids. To us, we don't see it like that because it's a part of our culture. Other cultures look at it and they're just like, it's kind of leaning on the side of like nationalism, which is probably not a good look. Or you could make fun of how the British put, was it beans on toast? You're just like, why? Why is that? Maybe it tastes good. I don't know. I'm not going to try it. Okay, so what is prejudice? Prejudice is a thought, not a behavior. Discrimination is the behavior. So we have to distinguish between those two things. Prejudice is a thought. Stereotypes play into prejudice. A stereotype is an overgeneralized attitude about a group. You could have quote unquote positive stereotypes versus quote unquote negative stereotypes. But even if you're like, oh, the role model stereotype, and you're like, oh, but that's a good characterization, it's still a stereotype. And you shouldn't overgeneralize about people. So these stereotypes demand that all members of a group fit the image of that group. Like in terms of gender roles. If you're a girl, then there might be an overgeneralization that you don't know how to fix cars or that you don't know about cars. So if you go into a mechanic, they may, based off that stereotype, try to jack up the prices on your bill. That's the idea that, oh, women aren't involved in mechanical car parts. Okay, that's an overgeneralization. Can women know about cars, know how to fix cars? Yes, absolutely. Anybody can. But it's an overgeneralization of what the female gender role is supposed to be. These stereotypes or these prejudices are unjustified negative judgments about a group. So like here, blondes versus brunettes. Blondes are adored, brunettes are ignored. Or if you want to do a negative stereotype about blondes, like, oh, blondes are so ditzy and dumb, that is a prejudice. That is a thought towards a group. It doesn't quite reach the level of discrimination. Once that thought becomes behavior, that's when it starts going over into the field of discrimination. So prejudice is prejudging a person based on what group you interpret them to be a part of. So these overgeneralized attitudes create a box that they try to fit members of that category into. They believe that they should behave in the manner that has been stereotyped or the manner that has been categorized within that. So stereotypes are internal. They are in your head, but then they can lead to discrimination, which is a type of behavior towards others. So with prejudice and stereotypes in society, a prejudice and a stereotype, those are thoughts, not actions. The discrimination based on those thoughts is a type of action. Okay, so when we talk about discrimination, we're talking about a group in power perpetuating negative actions against a group that's not in power. Okay, so racism is the categorization of a person or a group based on their race or ethnicity. And then part two, you also have to have the power to discriminate against that group. It has to be systemic mistreatment of the people within a targeted group. So racism has two parts, the prejudice part and the discrimination part. There's a difference between individual prejudice and institutional racism. Okay, so racism is discrimination plus the power to discriminate, individual versus institutionalized. So with the roots of prejudice, how do we get this? Well, you can get it from categorization, schemas, us versus them. In terms of developing schemas, that's something that humans do naturally. You do accommodation or assimilation. So when you're growing up, you may see a puppy and you think, oh, 4 legs, fur, a tail, that's a puppy. Then you see a cat and you say, oh, also puppy. It's like, no, that's not a puppy, that's a cat. So you have to create a new category or a new group. Okay, so sometimes we will apply that to individuals as well. Also, representation in media matters. You can't be what you can't see. So if you don't have enough representation for a particular group, gender, age, orientation, race, then you can have the emphasis of certain stereotypes being portrayed. There's like this big movement in African American literature and movies to move away from, just the focus on slavery and look at representation outside of that genocide of the African people. There's something outside of all of that. The scapegoating phenomenon is when a group in power has problems and they blame another group that's not in power for those problems. Now, the term scapegoat comes from the Old Testament, where prior to, the New Testament and the New Covenant, where the death of Jesus in Christianity was supposed to make up for the forgiveness of sins. Before that, it's often common to sacrifice animals like goats or horses or cows. And so the goat became the scapegoat that held all of the sins that they would then be forgiven for back in the Jewish tradition. This is going to be applied to populations. So for instance, in history, the bubonic plague, it affected Europe very, very negatively. It affected people in power in Europe negatively. Now, what religion were Europeans prior to 1492 mostly? They were Catholic. They were super Catholic. They were the group in power in Europe during that time, and even moving up until the 1500s. So as the bubonic plague began to spread, they didn't know about germ theory. They didn't know you should probably bathe more than once a year to keep from getting sick. They believed that disease or pestilence was a punishment from God. When the church couldn't help them, they had to turn to other reasons for why the bubonic plague was spreading. Well, who did the Catholics blame for the spread of the bubonic plague? No, it was the Jews.
Oh.
Okay, so they persecuted the Jewish population because the Jewish population had much lower counts of bubonic plague because they were much more hygienic. Okay, they focused more on actually, bathing and washing and being hygienic. And so the Jewish population got blamed for the bubonic plague. It was rumored that the Jews must have gone to the wells and poisoned the wells in order to attack the Christians. And so you see pogroms and other acts of discrimination against the Jewish population. They became the scapegoat for Europe's problems. This is going to happen again after World War I. Okay, World War I drastically devastated Germany. The Treaty of Versailles meant that they had to pay billions of dollars in reparations, and Hitler rose to power off of blaming who? The Jewish population. He blamed the Jews for somehow having control over the world market and backstabbing Germany, that they were undermining the country as a whole. And so he used that stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination in order to rise to power. The Holocaust is because he uses that racial discrimination in order to rise to power. Now, it's important to note, scapegoating is when the people in power blame a less powerful group, not the other way around, because the less powerful group doesn't have the power to discriminate. Could the Jewish population discriminate against the Germans? No. Could the Jewish population discriminate against the Catholics? No. That would be individual prejudice, not institutionalized discrimination. Another bias that reinforces this idea of stereotypes and prejudice is the just world phenomenon, which a shorter way of saying that is just saying karma. If you're a good person, good things happen to you. If you're a bad person, then bad things happen to you in a perfect world, right? Now, is that how the world actually works? Absolutely not. But if you're in a position of power and you believe that you deserve that power or you've earned that position or that wealth, then you're more likely to ascribe to the just world phenomenon. I'm where I'm supposed to be because of internal stable attributes. I am a good person, thus I deserve this. But if someone else is going through a hard time or going through difficulties, then it can't be external, unstable attributes like the economy or the housing market. It must be something specific to them. So like the just world phenomenon, you'd have the example of, oh, homeless people are homeless because they're lazy. That is not an accurate statement. Many homeless people hold down jobs. But do you know where you can live in the United States working a minimum wage job full time? Nowhere. Literally nowhere. So this is another one of those just world phenomenons bias of I'm where I'm at because I deserve to be where I'm at, and other people don't deserve what I have because there's something inherently wrong with them. All right, so if prejudice is a thought, then discrimination is a behavior. And discrimination can be differing treatment towards a group or a category of people. You can discriminate against someone based on race, gender, age, orientation, ableism, which is where they may have a disability or they're differently abled and they're discriminated against. There's a lot of different ways that people can face discrimination. But racism specifically is discrimination against a race and the power to discriminate against that group. Okay, so individual versus institutional. Okay, so we talked about stereotyping, where it's a generalization of a group based on an idea of what that group is or is not. So here we see some examples, especially after 9/11. I don't think y'all were alive then, were you? Okay, so after 9/11, we see increased Islamophobia, the assumption that all Muslims must somehow have it out against the Americans. So racism and discrimination that occurred. We've seen an increase in racial attacks against Asian Americans during the pandemic. We see discrimination against the African American population in America. There's a lot of conversation around that regarding hair. I remember a couple of years back, there was a wrestler and a high school team who wanted to compete. And at the competition, they told him, you can't compete unless you shave off your dreadlocks, like right there in front of everybody. You remember seeing that? Yeah. Yeah. And it's like right there. And he's just like, well, I want to be here for my team. I don't want my team to, and it's like, no one should have to cut your hair. Or most recently, I think it was last week, there was this little second grader, 8 or 9 years old, I believe. She went to school and on the school bus, a kid cut off her hair. And then her parents take her to the salon to get her hair fixed, right? She gets to pick out her style and everything. Well, then she goes back to school and a teacher and a librarian cut her hair to fix it without asking any permission from the parents. They're just like, we're just going to cut this child's hair. It's like, maybe don't touch other people. That would be pretty chill. So all of those can relate to stereotyping. It doesn't always have to be necessarily related to race. It could be related to age. It could be related to gender. But within stereotyping, you also have the risk of stereotype threat. So the person who's being stereotyped. Stereotype threat is a situation in which that people feel at risk of performing up to that stereotype. So like, let's say I was born a blonde, so I'm a blonde woman. I might be afraid that if I answer a question wrong in math class, that I'm fulfilling a stereotype of being ditzy and dumb as a blonde woman. Okay, because what two stereotypes are involved in that situation? As a blonde, I'm supposed to be dumb, and as a woman, I'm supposed to be bad at math or STEM fields. So that could be a stereotype threat. So maybe in reaction to that, because I don't want to fulfill the expectation that I'm supposed to perform, I might try to go the opposite direction. I might join the robotics team. I might start studying math more often. I might dye my hair to get away from that stereotype. So that would fall into stereotype threat. So again, the most important part of this is that prejudice is a thought, discrimination is a behavior. And for it to be an ism, you have to have power over the group that is being discriminated against as a social institution. When it comes to explaining the behavior involved in this, you can have some different influencing factors. You have the motivational perspective, the cognitive perspective, and the behavioral perspective. So how do people learn to be prejudiced or racist or ageist or misogynist, all of those things? So motivational factors, the belief that stereotypes are the result of an underlying reason. So why do we hurt others? to protect ourselves. Jackie and her friends ridicule a classmate in order to increase their self-esteem. So how a person acts towards you isn't really how they feel about you, it's more so about how they feel about themselves. So taking somebody else down to elevate themselves. In terms of the cognitive approach, the use of heuristics to form an impression about a group. What is a heuristic? A logical shortcut. It is the opposite of algorithm. Exactly right. So an algorithm takes a longer time, but it's almost always accurate. A heuristic is a shortcut. It's a rule of thumb, but that means that it is more prone to errors. So if I'm looking for a place to eat, I could do an algorithm where I sit down, go on the Yelp reviews, make a ranking system, see how many reviews are say what, blah, 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 blah. Or I could just drive around and see who has the busiest parking lot, who seems to have the most customers. And that could be my shortcut for, hey, they probably have good food. Now, could I be wrong? Yeah, it's a heuristic. It's a shortcut. This is often used in prejudice and stereotyping. So for example, Hank's brother wears glasses and reads. Therefore, Hank thinks that all people who wear glasses like to read. That is a heuristic. It could be that they just have bad eyesight. Then the behavioral model. This is one of the most common sense ones that we think of when it comes to prejudice and stereotyping. A person models behaviors that they see. Who are you going to model most as a child? Your parents. So you see what your parents do, and you're going to respond in kind. So Max's parents speak negatively about a people of a different race. One day at school, Max calls such students bad names. Where did they learn it from? They learned it at home. Or at least that's our general assumption of where they learned it. I remember when I was a detention officer, there was this one kid who decided to say the N-word, and he got slapped. He actually, he was sitting down and the guy slapped him across the face and he caught air. It was almost like slow motion. But then when his parents were being told, hey, he's in isolation on lockdown because this is what he did, they were just like, oh my gosh, I don't know where he could have learned that because we never use that kind of language. Because the automatic assumption is the way the kid behaves is the way the parents behave. So that's where they must have gotten that influence. Now, is that always necessarily true? No, it could also be peer groups that influence, as we're going to see with conformity, compliance, and obedience within a community. So dehumanization, this is a key part to racism and discrimination and atrocities in general. It's what it sounds like. Dehumanization is when you treat a group as if it is not human. Because of this, we find it easier to ignore the cognitive dissonance that occurs when we hurt somebody else. As just regular empathetic people, we might tell ourselves, yeah, there's no way I would say this thing or I would do this thing to another person because we see them as people. But if we're conditioned to dehumanize a certain group, then it's much more likely that our empathy will decrease and our risk for discrimination will increase. How did this occur with Hitler and the Jewish population? How did he dehumanize them?
Like the numbers?
In the concentration camps, the people that came in that weren't immediately executed would have their heads shaved, their clothing taken away from them, and they would be tattooed with a number. They would not be referred to by their names. Instead, they were always referred to as a number. So dehumanizing there, making a person into a barcode. But did the Holocaust immediately take off with concentration camps and the gassing of humans? No. How did it start? Yeah, he started separating them from the rest of society. And what did he tell the rest of society about the Jews? That they were undermining German purity. They were the reasons that the Germans had lost World War I because they had betrayed them. He called them roaches. He called them rats. He called them a disease, a plague, referring to them as non-human. All of that contributed towards the dehumanization of the Jewish population, the Roma population, the disabled population, the homosexual population within Germany, treating them as if they were a burden to society and that they were somehow at fault for the majority group's problems. So how did we study this with dehumanization? Well, y'all may remember Albert Bandura. He is going to come up with a study or an experiment within a college where he has college students being told that they're going to train another group of college students. So all of you are the college students, right, in the experiment. I tell you that I'm going to have a group of students and you're going to teach them something or train them using shocks. So every time they get the answer wrong, you're supposed to shock them. This sounds a lot like what experiment? Stanley Milgram experiment, where I've seen how far they would shock people if a person of authority told them, hey, keep shocking. So y'all are told students are going to arrive, and you have to shock them whenever they get an answer wrong to one of your questions. Now, when the students arrive, let's say I tell this group, Kiara, Gavin, and Sam, the subjects from the other school are here. Neutral. Y'all are my control group. There's no variable influencing how you behave towards them. Then to Felix, Matthew, and Ella Beth, I say the humanized line. The subjects from the other school are here, and they seem nice. Then to the rest of you, I say the subjects from the other school are here, and they seem like animals. This group is going to be less empathetic and more aggressive with their shocking. This group is going to be more empathetic. This group is going to be neutral. No effect on that baseline. So they are our baseline for it. So what this shows is that if you dehumanize someone, even with just words, something as simple as they seem nice or they seem like animals, then you can see escalated aggression towards that group. So the boys who imagined their victims as animals progressively elevated their shock levels significantly more than the neutral group. Humanizing labels help to reduce the aggression significantly below the level of the neutral control. So it goes from humanized, neutral, dehumanized in terms of levels of aggression. When the participants were interviewed subsequently about why they behaved as they did, what the researchers found was that the experimental condition enabled them to become morally disengaged, to activate a set of psychological mechanisms that minimized the evil of their deeds while justifying it in a variety of ways. After World War II, humanity was shocked that something of the scale of the Holocaust could ever have happened. Thus, we had the Nuremberg trials, where Nazis were put on trial for their crimes against the Geneva Convention and against humanity. What was their common refrain for why they did what they did? Yeah, they were just following orders. Okay, so that ties us into obedience and compliance and conformity. They justified what they were doing in a variety of ways. It was for the greater good of Germany. It was just the Jewish population. They were just following orders. It was their job. Okay? And they used that to get rid of the cognitive dissonance that would occur from them committing atrocities against other humans. We also have a study on prejudice known as the Robbers-Cade study. This is going to artificially create prejudice between two groups, and then it's going to de-escalate the prejudice against those two groups. So in this experiment, you have two groups of boys. They're all 11 years old. They're all middle class. They're all white. Are there any differences between these groups? No. They are the same, and yet they're kept separate. They don't know about each other. You have Group A and Group B. They're both at a camp, and for about a week, they just do camp stuff. Build fires, go fishing, all of that stuff. After that first week, they discover that the other group exists. Okay, so what the experimenters are going to do is they're going to put them into a competition. They're going to say, hey, look, Group A and Group B, we're going to have a Camp Olympics. Y'all are going to be playing against each other. As those games started taking place and they had that spirit of competitiveness against each other, the confrontations steadily escalated. They became more and more antagonistic, stealing stuff, setting fires, food fights. So this mutual prejudice had been artificially created. There was no external factors like racism, ageism, ableism, because they were all the same age, they were all from the same socioeconomic background, and they were all the same race. They had no reason to dislike each other, except for the fact that they were competing. So now that this artificial mutual prejudice has been created, the people conducting the study wanted to see if they could alleviate it. And it turns out they could. The experimenters then created situations that would be mutually beneficial to both groups, but only be accomplishable if the groups worked together. So they had to work together through cooperative efforts. These are called superordinate goals, shared goals that override differences among people and require their cooperation. So it benefits both groups as long as both groups work together. That can overcome this prejudice. So these prejudices were largely eliminated. Are there any examples for how this could be applied to today's world or history in general?
Could it be like the coronavirus, kind of? Because like if one person doesn't put a mask on, everybody could die for real. So I mean, like, you know.
That's a good example. The example I was thinking of was unions. Early on in the Gilded Age, monopolies, y'all remember J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, factory owners owned the means of production. Workers wanted more rights. Workers started unionizing for more rights. How did the factory owners break up those unions? Not only did they use violence, but they also used prejudice. If you're an African American worker in the factory or a white worker in the factory, you're still being taken advantage of by the factory owners. You have more in common than you have in contrast. So at first, unions didn't discriminate based on race. They didn't separate between the white unions and the black unions. They were all together until the factory owners started to break up those groups, make them less cohesive by playing in this created prejudice. Okay, so separating the house so that it crumbles.